Hi, good morning. My name is Alex Chapman. I'm here on behalf of the New Economics Foundation. We are a think tank based in Westminster. I'm normally one of the techie modelling type guys who sits behind a spreadsheet, and every now and again they'll let me out and I get to come out and talk about it. New Economics Foundation is a think tank that has been around for about 35 years or so, before I was born, and has, broadly speaking, put out one simple, consistent message throughout. And really all I'm going to do today is repeat that message with a little bit of extra context. And that is that the current economic system isn't working for people and the planet, and fundamentally is not adequate for delivering sustainability and is driving inequality. Now, I think in this age of fake news and disinformation, it's important to point out that we are a think tank. We are transparent about how we are funded. You're welcome to go on our website and look at how we are funded. There are a large number of other think tanks that will not be able to say the same. So do have a look at the biases that I may bring to this presentation. I think that's important to consider. So I'm going to sort of take a step back and try to construct an argument as to why economic justice is inseparable from environmental sustainability issues, and that all of the efforts and all the conversations that are going to happen in this room must be couched in a similar conversation about how those initiatives, those things that we want to change, can also address the fundamental inequalities and issues within the economic system. So there are going to be a few graphs, I apologise, and this is the New Economics Foundation, so there is going to be a bit of economics, so I apologise if I bore you, especially after you've been sitting there for an hour or so, but we'll get through it. So you might be familiar with this figure. This is the Living Planet Index from WWF, and that is the rate of decline of global wildlife over the last 40 years. Reducing approximately 60% between 1970 and about 2016 or so. In essence, the complete obliteration of the natural world. So we're here because we've declared a climate and ecological emergency or similar, but the emergency has been underway for 40 years or so. Now, the economic system as it currently works, I'm not interested in black or white. It has its strengths. There's no doubt that we have seen rises in life expectancy, we have seen increases in income. I would challenge necessarily over this period whether or not we've seen improvements in well-being fundamentally of people's lives. I think that's up for debate. People would disagree with me. Health is certainly better, educational attainment is certainly better, but the one thing that is unequivocal is that the natural world is not adequately factored into the current economic system, and this is evidence. Certainly over the last 50 years, the rate of destruction has dramatically increased. Now, one argument that you will often see put out is that you just have to go through this kind of a pathway where as we develop, as we get more economically productive, we start to have a big environmental impact, and then as we get wealthier, richer, we have more time on our hands to be able to think about environmental issues, we start to get more environmentally sustainable. That was the idea, that was the economics of the sort of 90s, early 2000s, environmental economics. Don't worry, we just need to get everyone to grow their economies a bit more, and then everyone will get to a place where we can protect the environment. That orthodoxy has now crumbled, because actually what we have seen is the outsourcing of environmental impacts. So my first challenge I'm putting down today is where are the consumption-based emissions in this picture. So we may well have found ways to improve the sustainability of our living locally, although there is still a huge amount of work to do in that regard. But what we've become very successful at doing is outsourcing our emissions to normally the global south. This figure here from the UN FAO of deforestation over the last 300 years kind of highlights that and the trends that have happened. So we see in green the temperate forests of the world being sliced away, those are the forests that are based mostly across Europe, Americas, what we consider to be the developed countries, happening way earlier, back in the 1700s. So it's not that China, who are often blamed for everything that's wrong in the world, are the ones who are creating all the emissions. It's just that we did all of ours a lot earlier. We did most of our deforestation and industrialization a few hundred years ago. We then shift, as we move towards the end of the 20th century, to deforestation of the tropical forests found in the global south, which, as everyone in this room will know, have been absolutely obliterated. Of course, those forests are not necessarily just being deforested for local consumption, they are being deforested for our consumption, particularly for the production of beef and other goods. So behind this is questions about responsibility, about global justice, who bears responsibility. We're going to have a lot of debates about this in the next sort of 10, 20 years. The 2030 target is a target for carbon reduction, carbon emissions reduction, which recognises our long-term responsibility for those historical emissions that we made. The 2050 target that the UK government is currently signed up for is one that sort of pretends that that didn't happen and pretends that we all started from a fairly sort of equal position in the modern day. Is that fair? Well, obviously I applaud the efforts that are going on here to accelerate on that target and to do better. But we also need to think about who is it that drives these emissions and these impacts overseas in what we've got here, the tropical forests of the world. Well, broadly speaking, they are British and American companies who own that land. In fact, about 60% of all wealth on planet Earth right now flows through the books of about 1,000 corporations. And what that wealth predominantly is made up of is land and assets, buildings, which create wealth, I suppose. And what we've seen alongside, if we go back, remember this graph of the decline of the ecological health over the last 50 years, we can also compare it to this graph, a little bit more complicated, which I'll take you through, which talks about the trajectory that we've gone on in terms of ownership and generation of income from capital. So what this is showing is that there is a large-scale agglomeration of what we call capital, ownership of assets, things like buildings. You know, the classic one is if you own a house and it just generates rent for you. Broadly speaking, you can sit there and make money off it without much activity. Actually, a bad landlord does that. A good landlord looks after the property and puts in a bit of time to look after it. But we've moved to this rent-seeking kind of economy where large amounts of wealth can be generated by sitting around and doing very little if you have the money to start with. And the rest of us, or if I think about my brother who cycles around London for Deliveroo and lives in a house, you know, about as big as, I don't know, one of these tables, who do not have those assets, battle on. And this creates a kind of injustice. But I suppose the key point here is that the corporate interests, particularly that own that significant amount of capital, are there overseas contributing to environmental destruction. Now, I think this becomes particularly important, and though that kind of paradigm becomes particularly important when we ask the question about needing to make a radical change in people's lives and what people see as fair when we propose to make those changes. So if we're now saying, right, we all need to clean up our act, we all need to reduce our emissions, and the people of Britain are seeing this trend, the line on the top there is the growth in the wealth of the top 1,000 people in this country, and the line below it is the median wages of the population of this country. A vast agglomeration of wealth at one end, contributing to massive ecological decline, and broadly speaking, a populace who are still struggling to get by, then the people will not accept it. They will not accept the types of changes that are going to be needed to be made, which do include some significant alterations to the way we live. We've seen two presentations now about the types of changes that need to be made, and what I would add to those presentations is that the changes we're expecting are fundamental to people's lives. Ultimately, some people are going to have to drive less. Councils are going to need to close some roads, and they're not popular things to do as a council, trust me. They might need to change the way that rubbish collection takes place. Maybe, as they do in Norway, they're going to need to charge for the collection of non-recyclable waste. That's not going to be popular. Now, these are the types of policies that can be done in different ways, and they can be done in a socially just way, and they can be done in a non-socially just way. And if they are implemented in a non-socially just way, and the people of Britain see this, the people who, many of whom will be around these tables today, but also I would hazard a guess, a certain group within the current British community might not be represented here today, those who are living on the margins or under the pressure of 4 different jobs at one time. If they are to be sold, okay, you now need to pay more for your non-recyclable waste, or you now need to pay a fuel tax on your petrol, where do we end up? I think it's a dangerous situation, especially with the rise of Trump politics. Now, at the moment it sounds like I'm talking very abstractly about a problem that I see coming, and maybe I'm just making this all up, but we've already seen this in France. So the protests, which were known as the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vest movement in France, which shut down France on and off for the last 2-3 years, were a response to a fuel tax that was called an eco-tax. And it was fundamentally about the idea that this tax affected a group of people who were already feeling like they were on the margins of society. They were not being swept up in this rise of wealth that was being agglomerated in the capital. They did not have the capital wealth, and then they were being asked to pay whatever it was, 10p more per litre at the pump, and they need their car for their day-to-day lives for whatever reason. It was particularly in the rural areas, actually, that this initially rose up, because those are the people who needed their car to be able to get around, had no other option. Interestingly, the demands of that movement, which came not really from any particular political spectrum, there was people in those protests from the left and from the right, but demands that they came out with included things like a much higher minimum wage and a wealth tax. So these are the types of demands that say we want some form of justice. Before you impose these types of environmental policies on us, we want to see some kind of balancing. So that brings me to probably the New Economics Foundation's biggest contribution to environmental economics over the last 35 years, and that is the Green New Deal. It was around about 2008, and the banks had all crashed, that a group of economists at the New Economics Foundation and others, including Caroline Lucas down the road, came together and said, if we're going to make a huge intervention in the UK economy, which actually at the time involved printing money, that thing that you can never supposedly do, the government did, they printed money, let's use that to drive a rapid transition to a green economy. Ultimately, of course, that's not what happened. That money was used to bail out the bankers. Now, we said at the time, we stole the language of the New Deal. And we stole that from Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was at the start of the 20th century, which was a package of investment which was used to drive the US out of a recession. So there was precedent for it, and it was very effective at the time. So we had this argument, we put it out there, we stole it kind of from the US, and we said, right, the UK should use this to dig its way out. Unfortunately, we were ignored. History tells the rest. However, about a year or two ago, imagine our surprise when almost overnight, mostly thanks to this woman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Green New Deal was back. We were getting a lot of phone calls. We had to dust the report off the wall and say, okay, right. Somehow or other, she had got wind of this idea and decided that the framing of it, the concept of a new deal for workers, offering them a new settlement, and the concept of rapid decarbonisation of the economy needed to come back, and it has come back big time. In fact, who knows, maybe it will be on the agenda of the Democrat Party in the next US election. To an extent, it was in the last election, although debate around this type of thing was not as strong as potentially we would have liked in 2019 or 2017. It had 5 principles. Total decarbonisation of the economy in a way which enhances the well-being of people, the creation of millions of well-paid, secure and unionised jobs, transforming the financial system so it serves the needs of people and planet, protecting and restoring habitats to reverse ecological decline, and promoting global justice, supporting others to decarbonise, and taking account of our historical responsibility. All very lofty, nice ideas. Practically, how does that work? Well, broadly speaking, the idea is significant investment. The UK has lacked chronically, in comparison to virtually any other European country, it's had far less investment than any other economy. Let's invest in the industries we want to see of the future. Next point is about devolution of power and saying, what about if we gave the power to local, regional people and government structures to decide how they want their economy to play out over the next 10, 20 years? Rewriting of the rules of the economy, and incidentally, we saw this just starting to happen the other day with the Heathrow decision, hooray, where for the first time we set a precedent that you actually now can hold a decision accountable on climate grounds, which of course is a key part of rewriting the rules of the economy for it to be more sustainable, but it also needs to focus on how, on the value of work, insecure work, quality of living, issues around universal credit and services, of course, as well, are key, along with key changes, regulation, and, of course, international alliances and learning, which I don't have time to talk about a huge amount today, but, of course, is very important. But that's still kind of useless to all of you here now. And we've had all these phone calls, people saying, right, come out, speak to us around the country, and tell us, we want to do a local Green New Deal. And, of course, all of that is fairly useless to you, you might argue, because it takes a lot of change at the central and top level of government for us to allow that. Broadly speaking, that's not the way things tend to work. We can't wait for the government to make the right changes that we need. We have to start doing it right now, and the government will follow. And ultimately, that is, history bears that out. Any kind of societal change or shift in the way of doing things comes from pressure from people from below, demanding and making it inevitable that the changes that we need happen. So practically, what can we do, we as in us here? And you're already on the way on some of these. So, first of all, we have to ramp up pressure on local and national institutions such that action is the only possible option. And of course, the raft of climate emergency declarations across the country shows that that is possible. Councils responding to their local residents and the like. Second, we need to generate a mandate for action, and as I say, that mandate needs to come in a form which means people are willing to accept quite significant changes to the way they're going to live. That's where we come to the idea of citizens' assemblies, which are now starting to take hold across the country. We're seeing one happen at the national level, and there's been sort of 3 or 4 different forms of citizens' assemblies, people coming together, but crucially, not just climate activists, as great as they and we and I and all of us are, you have to bring people who are outside of that bubble to the table to get that mandate for action, to say, what would it take for us to make the kind of changes that involve going into your home, stripping it out, insulating a home is a really invasive process. How can we get that mandate to act? Third of all, building cross-community alliances, which is why this is so incredibly important. One of the great things about my job is I get to go out and speak at these types of events and see that this is happening all over the country right now. And this is on a new level, a whole different scale from what it was even 3 years ago when green groups were putting together conferences and the like. So yes, forge cross-community alliances, which means not just activists, but everyone in the community. It means we need the trade unions at the table, we need the big anchor institutions, we need the big employers in the area. And to do that, one of the mechanisms that some areas are using is the Climate Change Commission, which brings together key institutions from around the borough and carries forward a plan of action, perhaps in a slightly less politically neutral, or more politically neutral way than the council can. And also ensuring that continuity, because we need to carry this forward all the way for the next 10 years, or beyond that, if let's say 2030 is our target. Focus in on the social justice harmonies of our of the climate crisis. So I don't think there's enough of a conversation about the link between insulating homes, the biggest source of emissions, and the issue of fuel poverty. Fundamentally, you might even lead with the fuel poverty argument, because that is what is going to get you into people's homes and make them understand This is something that's there for all of us, and is benefiting us. Not just a bunch of green people are going to come in and retrofit your home and disrupt you for the next month or so. Is that can we cap energy bills? Obviously, that's a hot topic at the moment. Can we cap energy bills at the same time as doing home retrofit? And the like, public transport accessibility, another key issue. The left behind communities, especially elderly groups in this country now, isolated because of the poor quality public transport. Make it first a matter of social justice, and second a matter of environmental sustainability to come just naturally. And finally, actually there is one more, but it's not really relevant. So keep ownership democratic and local. So going back to the original problems of outsourcing, loss of control, massive wealth agglomeration by the 1% or even the 0.1%, way to fight that and to show people that this is for them, this is part of your community, is to keep ownership local, to talk about how you can have democratic ownership, croptisation. We talked about cooperative ownership of energy, but it can go way beyond that. Cooperative ownership of the retrofitting processes, organisations like Retrofit Works that focus on that, and lots to learn from the Preston model, which gets talked a lot about how you can do procurement locally and encourage local businesses to get involved with procurement processes. Now finally, really finally, ultimately, in order to get to zero carbon at a borough level, most people agree that you can't do it without central government changes. They have to give us changes in regulation, changes to financing, give us more money and such. Otherwise, we can get to say 40% reduction and then we need a key policy or legislation change. And that's only going to happen if we demand it from them. So the way to do that is we need to put alliances across regions, across local authorities, across groups, right across the country, who are hitting these same barriers, say a planning barrier that we can't get around because of the current framework, and get together and say this needs to change. And we've proven now, we're in a moment now where things are changing, because look at what happened with Heathrow. We've just got the power to do onshore wind, just came back a few days ago. Again, that's a result of massive pressure from green movements. The M4 in South Wales was scrapped. Bristol Airport expansion was scrapped by the council because of public pressure, in opposition to the recommendations they were given by their own council officers. They fought back against it and said, no, we're going to do something different. And then we've got Chris Packham now starting a legal challenge around the climate impacts of HS2, which, bizarrely, for being a train project, HS2 actually has a net carbon impact. Anyway, the message is, we can win this. Good luck.